Welcome to the British International Sports Medicine Academy. In this lesson, we're studying the Level 3 unit, Anatomy and Physiology for Exercise. Muscle structure and function. Here are our session aims. We're going to begin by explaining the cellular structure of muscle fibers. Then we're going to go on to describe the sliding filament theory and explain the effects of different types of exercise on muscle fiber types. We'll describe the ability of muscle fibers to adapt to training. We'll end the lesson with muscles, looking at the name of the muscle, the location and function, as well as the attachment sites. Our muscles are covered by a fibrous sheath called the epimysium. Within the muscle, we have bundles of muscle fibers. A bundle of muscle fibers is called a fascicle, and these are also covered by a connective sheath called the perimysium. And our individual muscle fibers are also covered by a sheath called the endomysium. The muscle fibers are made up of smaller elements known as myofibrils. It is along the myofibril that you find the smallest contractile unit within the muscle, the sarcomere. The sarcomeres are what give skeletal muscle its striated appearance, and it's the sarcomeres that contain the small myofilaments, contractile proteins, myosin and actin. As you recall from your Level 2 Anatomy and Physiology, when stimulated by a nerve cell, the myosin heads attach to the actin, pulling the actin filaments over the myosin filaments towards the center of the sarcomere, which causes our muscle to shorten or contract. Surrounding the myofibrils, we have the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Now, the sarcoplasmic reticulum is important because it stores calcium. Calcium plays an important role in muscular contraction. When calcium is released, it reveals the binding sites along the actin filaments, which allows the myosin heads to then attach. For contractions to occur, our muscles need a continual supply of both ATP as well as calcium. We have two types of muscle fibers within the body. The type of muscle fiber is determined by the speed at which it contracts, as well as the way in which it generates adenosine triphosphate. Slow twitch muscle fibers produce ATP in the presence of oxygen. The production of ATP is slow, and that's why we call slow twitch fibers slow oxidative fibers. Let's review some of the characteristics of our type 1 slow twitch muscle fibers. Because of the way in which they generate adenosine triphosphate, they need to have a good supply of capillaries, bringing them oxygenated blood. They also have a great deal of myoglobin. So myoglobin are similar to hemoglobin within the blood in that they are oxygen-binding proteins that we find within our muscle cells. And these are also what give type 1 muscle fibers their red coloration. Type 1 muscle fibers also have more mitochondria than type 2 muscle fibers because when generating ATP in the presence of oxygen, this can only take place within the mitochondria. When doing low to moderate intensity aerobic or endurance type exercises, you're predominantly recruiting your type 1 muscle fibers, and as a result, these forms of exercise condition these specific muscle fibers. Examples include walking or jogging or swimming at low to moderate intensities. Type 2 muscle fibers are split into two separate categories, so we have type 2A and type 2B. Type 2A can generate ATP both aerobically and anaerobically, so with or without the presence of oxygen. They are referred to also as fast oxidative glycolytic fibers, whilst type 2B fibers generate ATP anaerobically without oxygen, and they're called fast glycolytic fibers. Let's look at some of the characteristics of our type 2 muscle fibers. So they are much more powerful than type 1 muscle fibers. Remember, power considers both strength and speed. So these muscle fibers allow us to work at very high intensities, however, for shorter durations of time. Type 2 muscle fibers are actually much thicker than type 1 because they contain more actin and myosin. However, they have less mitochondria, myoglobin, and they don't have as good of a blood supply as the type 1 muscle fibers. When we do high intensity, short duration activities or exercise, such as sprinting or powerlifting, those are the forms of exercise that recruit these type 2 muscle fibers. And if we want to condition the type 2 muscle fibers, then those are the activities that would be best. Muscles and muscle actions. Let's begin with our upper body muscles. Do you remember the names of the muscles within the upper body that you learned at level 2? As we go through the muscles, make note of the origins, insertions, and the joint actions that will result when the muscles shorten or contract. When a muscle contracts, the insertion moves closer to the origin. In this image, we have the levator scapulae. The origin of this muscle is within our cervical vertebrae, particularly C1 through C4. It inserts on the medial border of our scapula. The joints in which the muscle crosses is the shoulder girdle. The joint actions resulting from the contraction of our levator scapulae are elevation of the scapula as well as lateral flexion of our neck. Think of the exercises that you can do to condition your levator scapulae. Shoulder shrugs, for example. Now let's have a look at our trapezius. Our trapezius originates within C7, the 7th cervical vertebrae, as well as all of our thoracic vertebrae. The trapezius inserts onto the clavicle and the scapula. The joint crossed is the shoulder girdle, and the joint actions resulting from the contraction of the trapezius are threefold. The upper fibers extend the neck. The middle fibers retract the scapulae, and the lower fibers depress the scapula. So think of the exercises that you'll need to do to work the muscle in full. Reverse flies would be a good exercise, and you can amend the starting position to specifically target the 3 different parts of this large muscle. Your rhomboid is found below the trapezius, and it also originates on the cervical vertebrae, C7, as well as the upper thoracic vertebrae, T1 through T5. It inserts onto your scapula, and the joints in which it crosses are the shoulder girdle. The joint action resulting from rhomboid contraction is retraction of the scapula. The pectoralis major, the largest of our chest muscles, originates within the clavicle and sternum, and it inserts onto our humerus. The joints crossed are the shoulder joint. The joint actions that result when the pectoralis major contracts or shortens are horizontal flexion, adduction, and inward rotation. Can you give me an exercise that will work our pectoralis major? The bench press and chest flies are both great exercises to work your pectoralis major. The serratus anterior originates on the front of our ribs, ribs 1 through 8, and it inserts on the anterior surface of our scapula. The joints crossed are the shoulder girdle. The joint action resulting from contraction of this muscle is protraction of the scapulae. Shoulder joint muscles. Our deltoid muscles originate on our clavicle, that's the anterior delts. The medial delts originate on the acromion process, and the posterior delts originate on the spine or top of the scapula. The deltoids insert nearly halfway down the lateral or side surface of our humerus. The joints that is crossed is the shoulder, particularly the glenohumeral joint, and the joint actions that result vary. So the anterior fibers assist with horizontal flexion. All of the fibers abduct the shoulder, particularly the medial fibers, and the posterior fibers extend the shoulder. The latissimus dorsi is a large muscle that originates in the thoracolumbar fascia, TLF, as well as within our thoracic vertebrae, our lumbar and sacral vertebrae, and the iliac crest. It also has origins on the inferior or bottom edge of the scapula. It inserts onto the top of our humerus, the anterior or front-facing side of the humerus. The joints crossed are the shoulder joint, the glenohumeral joint, and the joint actions that result when the latissimus dorsi shortens. We see adduction of our arm as well as extension of the arms. And the latissimus dorsi also assists with medial rotation of the arm, and it also depresses the shoulder girdle. Rotator cuff muscles. Let's begin with the supraspinatus muscle. The origin is superior to the spine of the scapula, and it inserts superiorly on the head of the humerus, so on the top of the humerus head. It crosses the shoulder joint. This muscle stabilizes the shoulder joint, helping to prevent dislocation. It also assists the deltoid in abduction of our arm. The subscapularis originates on the anterior, so the front surface of our scapula, and it inserts anteriorly on the head of the humerus. This muscle crosses the shoulder joint, and it also stabilizes our shoulder joint. And the muscle also assists with rotation of the arm towards the midline or medially. The infraspinatus originates inferior to the spine of the scapula, and it inserts laterally on the head of our humerus, so on the side of the head of the humerus. It crosses the shoulder joint, and it also stabilizes the shoulder joint, as do all our rotator cuff muscles. And this muscle also laterally rotates the arm. The teres minor and major both originate on the lateral border of the scapula and insert onto the humerus. They also play a part in stabilizing the shoulder joint as they cross the shoulder joint, and they assist with rotation of the arm. Arm muscles. The biceps brachii is a large muscle in our upper arm, and it has two heads, which originate on our scapula. The muscle inserts on the top of the radius and within the bicipital aponeurosis found in the medial part of the forearm. The bicipital aponeurosis is a form of connective tissue. This muscle crosses both the shoulder and elbow joints, and the joint action that results when our biceps brachii shorten is flexion of the elbow, supination of the forearm, and it also assists when flexing the shoulder. Brachialis is also a muscle found in our upper arm, which originates on our humerus and inserts on our ulnar bone in our lower arms. It crosses the elbow joint, and when it contracts or shortens, it flexes the elbow. The brachioradialis originates laterally at the end of the humerus, and it inserts laterally at the end of the radius. It also crosses the elbow, and when it contracts or shortens, it assists with flexion when the forearm is semi-pronated, and it also assists other forearm flexors. The triceps is a large muscle found on the back of our upper arm. It has three heads. One origin is on the long head of the scapula, just above our shoulder joint. The other two heads originate on the posterior or backside of our humerus. It inserts on the olecranon process of the ulna, and it crosses the elbow as well as the shoulder joint. And when our triceps shorten, we see extension of the elbow, and it also assists in shoulder extension and adduction. Vertebral column muscles. The erector spinae group, also known as the iliocostalis group, consists of three separate muscles, which originate either on the ribs or iliac crest. They insert on the transverse processes of our cervical vertebrae and our ribs superior to the origin. The joints crossed are the vertebrae, and the joint action that results when these muscles contract is extension of the spine. The transverse processes are bony projections on the side of each of our vertebrae. The longissimus group consists of two muscles which originate on the transverse processes of our cervical, thoracic, and lumbar vertebrae. They insert on the transverse processes of superior vertebrae to the origin. The joints crossed are the vertebral joints. The joint actions are extension of the spine, and these muscles also extend and rotate the head. Spinalis muscle originates on the spinous processes of our cervical, thoracic, and lumbar vertebrae, and it inserts on the spinous processes of vertebrae superior to the origin. The spinalis muscle originates on the spinous process of the cervical, thoracic, and lumbar vertebrae. The spinous processes are bony projections off the back of the vertebrae, and the spinalis muscle inserts on the spinous processes of vertebrae superior to the origin. The joints crossed are the vertebrae joints, and the joint action is extension of the spine. The quadratus lumborum muscle originates on our iliac crest and our iliolumbar fascia. This muscle inserts on the upper four lumbar vertebrae and the lower margin of our 12th rib. The joints crossed are the intervertebral joints of our lumbar vertebrae, and the joint actions are lateral flexion of our lumbar spine, and this muscle also assists in preventing hyperflexion of our lumbar spine. The multifidus muscle originates on our sacrum and transverse processes of our vertebrae, and it inserts on the spinous processes of the vertebrae superior to the origin. The joints crossed are intervertebral joints, and the joint actions are extension of the vertebrae, and it also assists in rotation of the vertebral column and lateral flexion of our spine. The multifidus is a local or deep muscle that stabilizes our lumbar spine. Anterior abdominal wall muscles. The rectus abdominis muscle, as well as our external obliques, are superficial muscles, so those are the muscles that we can actually see. The rectus abdominis originates within our pubis and our pubis symphysis. It inserts on our rib cage and the base of our sternum. The joints crossed are our intervertebral joints of our lumbar and thoracic vertebrae, and the joint action that results when we contract or shorten our rectus abdominis is flexion of our vertebral column. The external obliques originate on the outer surface of our bottom 8 ribs, and they insert mainly in the linea alba as well as the iliac crest. The linea alba is a fibrous line that you find running down the middle of the anterior abdominal wall. The joints crossed are the intervertebral joints of the lumbar and thoracic vertebrae, and the joint actions are rotation and lateral flexion, as well as flexion of the vertebral column. The internal obliques originate within our thoracolumbar fascia, as well as on our iliac crest, and this muscle inserts onto the linea alba as well as the bottom 3 ribs. The joints crossed are our intervertebral joints of our lumbar and our thoracic vertebrae, and the joint actions are rotation, lateral flexion, as well as flexion of the vertebral column. The transverse abdominis originates within the linea alba, and it inserts onto our intervertebral joints of the lumbar vertebrae. The joints crossed are our intervertebral joints of our lumbar and thoracic vertebrae, and the joint actions are compression of our abdominal cavity, which can increase our intra-abdominal pressure, which offers support and stabilization to our core. Pelvic girdle and hip joint muscles. The psoas major muscle originates in the transverse processes and intervertebral disc of all of our lumbar vertebrae, as well as one of the thoracic vertebrae, T12, and it inserts on the top of our femur. The joints crossed are the hip and the intervertebral joints of our lumbar vertebrae. When this muscle contracts, you see flexion of the hip. It also assists with lateral flexion of our trunk or core, and it stabilizes our lumbar spine. It also helps us sit up. The iliacus muscle originates on the inside surface of our ilium, and it inserts on the top of our femur. The joints crossed are the hip, and when this muscle contracts, it flexes our hip. The sartorius originates on our iliac crest, and it inserts on our tibia. It crosses the hip and knee joints, and the joint actions resulting from contraction of this muscle are flexion and lateral rotation of our hip, as well as flexion of the knee. And the sartorius is the longest muscle in the body. The tensor fasciae latae originate on the crest of our ilium and insert on the iliotibial tract or band, which is connective tissue. And the joints crossed are the hip and knee, and when this muscle contracts, it causes flexion of the hip, and it also assists with abduction of the hip and medial rotation of our hip. The gluteus maximus originates within the base of our spine on the sacrum and coccyx, as well as the back of our ilium bone, and it inserts on the iliotibial tract and the femur. It crosses the hip joint, and when it contracts, it causes the joint actions, extension and lateral rotation of our hip. The gluteus medius originates on the outer surface of our ilium. It inserts laterally on the top of the femur. It crosses the hip joint, and when it contracts, it abducts the hip. It also assists with medial rotation of our thigh, and the posterior fibers laterally rotate the hip when the hip is flexed. It's important for hip stabilization. The gluteus minimus originates on the outer surface of the ilium as well. It inserts laterally on the top of the femur. It crosses the hip joint, and when it contracts, it abducts the hip. It also assists with medial rotation of the thigh, and the posterior fibers laterally rotate the hip when the hip is flexed. So very similar to the gluteus medius muscle, and it's also important for hip stabilization. Exercises where you're required to balance the body on one leg are really good for conditioning this muscle. The piriformis originates on the anterior surface of our sacrum. It inserts on the top of the femur. The joint crossed are the hips, and the joint actions are abduction of the hip. It also assists with lateral rotation of the hip. The adductor muscles, adductor magnus, longus, and brevis, originate within our pubis, and they insert on the medial, posterior surface of the femur. The joint crossed is the hip, and the joint action is adduction of the hip. The pectineus muscle originates on our pubis and inserts on the femur. It crosses the hip joint, and when it contracts, it adducts the hip and flexes the hip. It also assists in turning the thigh inwards, medial rotation. The gracilis originates within the pubis, and it inserts within the top of the tibia, right below our knee joint. It crosses both the hip and knee joints, and the joint actions that result when this muscle contracts is adduction of the hip, and it also assists with knee flexion. Upper leg muscles. We have 4 muscles within our quadricep group: the rectus femoris, the vastus medialis, the vastus intermedius, which is under or below our rectus femoris, as well as our vastus lateralis. The rectus femoris originates on the iliac spine and the top of the acetabulum. The vastus medialis and intermedius, as well as lateralis, originate on our femur. All of our quadricep muscles insert on the front of the tibia via our patella tendon. The joints crossed are knee and hip. The rectus femoris is the only quadricep that crosses both these joints. The others just cross the knee joint. The joint actions are extension of our knee, and the rectus femoris also flexes the hip. The hamstring group consists of three separate muscles: the biceps femoris, the semimembranosus, and the semitendinosus. All three muscles originate within our ischium, and the semimembranosus and semitendinosus insert on our tibia bone, whilst the bicep femoris inserts on the head of our fibula bone. These muscles cross the knee and hip joint, and when they contract, they cause the joint actions knee flexion as well as hip extension. Lower leg muscles. The tibialis anterior originates on the tibia bone as well as the interosseous membrane. It inserts on the medial cuneiform bone or tarsal bone as well as our first metatarsal. It crosses the ankle joint, and when it contracts, it causes ankle dorsiflexion as well as inversion of our subtalar joint. The gastrocnemius originates on the femur just above our knee, and it inserts on the calcaneus via the Achilles tendon. It crosses the ankle and knee joint, and the joint actions that result when it contracts are plantar flexion of our ankle, and it also assists with knee flexion. The soleus originates on our tibia, fibula, and the interosseous membrane. It inserts within the calcaneus via the Achilles tendon. It crosses the ankle joint as well, and when it contracts, it causes ankle plantar flexion. Can you now explain the cellular structure of muscle fibers? Can you describe the sliding filament theory and explain the effects of different types of exercise on our muscle fiber types? Can you also explain the adaptations to training that we see within our muscle fibers? Can you now name, locate, and state the function of muscles as well as their attachment sites within the body? If so, please take a look at the next slide and select the area of the body where we'll find the psoas major, the levator scapular, and the tensor fascia latae. So how did you do? If you found any of those questions difficult, please go back and re-listen to that portion of the lesson. Thank you for listening.